There's a pattern in history that strikes the same way every time. A nation believes its divisions are manageable, its disagreements ordinary, its tensions temporary, until one day the fault lines beneath it reveal themselves as borders. In 1777, the early United States was not a unified country, but a loose cluster of regions with competing economies. In 1861, the tension between states and federal authority tore the nation apart in the bloodiest conflict on American soil. In the 1930s, with the Great Depression ravaging the country, states openly defied federal orders, and governors deployed local forces to resist Washington's directives. Here's what nobody tells you. Political fractures don't appear suddenly. They grow slowly, silently, invisibly. One policy, one election, one migration wave at a time. And analysts suggest that some of the same pressures that broke past empires may be reappearing today in subtler forms. The title raises a provocative question. When America splits into regions, red states, blue states, separate countries. But according to some analysts, this framework should not be read as a guaranteed prediction. Instead, they argue it might reflect a historical pattern of fragmentation that nations experience when economic geography and political identity stop aligning. This is where the pattern begins, not with a declaration, but with a divergence. A divergence in values, a divergence in economic priorities, a divergence in how different regions imagine their future. Let me show you exactly how this divergence forms. For decades, internal migration in the United States has reshaped the demographic map. People leaving the Northeast for the South, people leaving California for Texas, people leaving the Midwest for mountain states. These moves aren't just economic decisions, they are political resorting events. When millions of people cluster into regions aligned with their beliefs, the nation stops functioning as a single ideological marketplace. It becomes two, or more, separate political realities sharing a flag. Here's why this matters. Political unity requires mixed geography. When geography becomes sorted, compromise becomes rare. At first, this sorting looks harmless. People simply want lower taxes, cheaper housing, better weather, or different lifestyles. But everyone thought they were safe in every historical case where regions split. They weren't. The danger wasn't what they saw, it was what they ignored. In the late Roman Empire, migration patterns split the empire into Western and Eastern blocks long before it officially divided. In Yugoslavia, decades of quiet clustering preceded the eruption of separatist movements. In the United States, regional identity has always existed, but analysts argue that the modern divide between red and blue states may represent something more structural, competing visions of governance. Consider the economic dimensions. In 1860, the agricultural South and industrial North were two economies pretending to be one nation. Today, some economists argue that the post-industrial coasts and the energy-producing interior represent similarly divergent models. One scenario suggests that when regions operate on fundamentally different economic engines, technology hubs on the coasts, manufacturing belts in the Midwest, energy corridors in the South, national cohesion becomes difficult. Not unity. Trade-offs, not shared destiny. Competing futures. Here's what nobody tells you. Nations fragment not because they want to, but because the cost of holding together becomes higher than the cost of drifting apart. And the cost doesn't begin with secession movements or constitutional crises. It begins with the daily friction of incompatible priorities. Water rights, energy grids, environmental policy, education requirements, social policy, tax structures. When these issues become regional rather than national, governments struggle to govern. Policy becomes paralysis. Paralysis becomes resentment. Resentment becomes identity. Let me show you exactly how identity becomes the ignition point. Throughout history, political identity shifts faster than borders do. In 1860, many Americans identified first with their state, then with their region, and only then with the nation. In the 1930s, states like Louisiana and California acted independently during economic and political crises. Identity does not need legal borders to draw psychological ones. And today, according to some analysts, the United States may be experiencing the early stages of identity clustering. Red states crafting one model of governance. blue states crafting another. Federal policy squeezed between incompatible visions. Here's why this matters for the modern world. Once identity clusters, economies follow. Businesses relocate to states that match their politics. Workers migrate toward regions aligned with their values. Investors choose states based on regulatory stability. As capital flows resort the map, the country stops functioning as one interconnected economy and begins operating as parallel regional blocks. Not collapse. Drift, not explosion. Separation of incentives. At first, it looked like a miracle, the freedom for states to govern according to the will of their people. Then the bill arrived. Coordinating national infrastructure became harder. Building unified energy policy became nearly impossible. Negotiating national budgets became a battlefield. And the deeper question grew louder. What holds a nation together when states no longer share a common vision of the future? Here's the mechanism at work beneath the surface. The Constitution created a system that relies on shared norms more than force. Those norms, respect for federal authority, agreements about electoral legitimacy, trust in institutions, are the glue. When the glue weakens, the structure still stands, but it creaks. Some analysts argue that political polarization, competing economic ecosystems, and growing distrust in institutions may be reducing the flexibility that once kept the system stable. The foundation doesn't crack all at once. It strains, quietly, relentlessly. This is where the pattern begins to turn from historical echo to modern scenario. In the same way 1770s America was divided by loyalty to crown or independence, and the 1850s were divided by economic ideology, the 2020s may be divided by a new axis, not geography but worldview. And worldviews, when concentrated geographically, behave like nations long before they declare themselves. Here's what nobody tells you. Nations don't split when borders are drawn. They split when people stop seeing themselves as one people, when political victories in one region are seen as defeats in another, when federal decisions are interpreted not as law but as intrusion, when local identity becomes more meaningful than national identity. History is clear. Every major fragmentation begins with that shift. Some economists argue that America may be experiencing the first phase of such a shift, not secession, but separation of incentives. One scenario suggests regions could begin coordinating policies with neighboring states more than with Washington. Another scenario suggests economic blocs could form around energy, technology, and agriculture. A third scenario, considered highly unlikely but still modeled by analysts, imagines a slow drift toward regional autonomy, where national cohesion weakens without any formal break. The question the world watches is the same one empires always face when internal lines harden. What forces would need to align for regional America to become thinkable? Because the most revealing part of that answer emerges only when we follow the next step in the pattern, the hidden mechanics behind fragmentation, and the scenarios analysts believe could shape America's future. Here's the mechanism behind every great national fracture. It never begins with borders. It begins with competing centers of gravity. Economies pull one way, cultures pull another, governance splits into parallel visions. And slowly, the fabric that once held millions together starts to stretch until it no longer returns to shape. Some analysts argue that modern America, with its deepening red-blue divide, may be drifting toward this early-stage gravitational split. Not guaranteed, not predetermined, but conditional on forces that history has shown to be destabilizing when they overlap. This is where the pattern begins. Not with war, with divergence. Let me show you exactly how divergence becomes structural. The United States was designed as a federation of semi-sovereign states, each with its own identity, laws, and priorities. For most of American history, these differences were manageable because economic interests overlapped. A farmer in the Midwest, a banker in New York, a miner in the Rockies, and a factory worker in Pennsylvania all participated in one integrated economic system. But when technological revolutions reshaped the economy after 2000, the rise of Silicon Valley, the collapse of manufacturing towns, the growth of energy-producing regions, different states began living inside different economic realities. One scenario suggests that when economic priorities diverge, Political priorities follow, and once political priorities diverge, national consensus becomes rare. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. The danger wasn't what they saw, it was what they ignored. The divergence expanded into identity. For decades, Americans lived with political differences but still shared a common narrative of who they were. But analysts point out that identity is now clustering regionally. Red states shaping conservative cultural and legal structures, blue states shaping progressive ones. This doesn't simply create disagreement. It creates parallel moral universes. What is normal in one region is intolerable in another. What is law in one region is outlawed in another. Not unity. Duality. And duality, multiplied over years, becomes fragmentation of meaning, the quiet precondition for fragmentation of governance. Here's what nobody tells you. Fragmentation always begins invisibly inside the machinery of daily life. Supply chains start rerouting around political frictions. Corporations choose states not for tax breaks but for ideological alignment. Universities cluster talent along political borders. State governments begin coordinating policy with neighboring states that share their worldview. Over time, the country functions less like a single market and more like a series of regional ecosystems. It does not look like a break. It looks like drift. Let me show you exactly how this drift could evolve under 3 conditional scenarios. Scenario 1. Soft decentralization. This scenario, considered plausible by many analysts, imagines no formal breakup at all, just an era where states assert much more control over their internal affairs. Federal authority remains intact, but its influence thins as states pass contradictory laws, build independent regulatory frameworks, and form alliances with like-minded regions. The country remains united legally, but divided operationally. A patchwork nation, still standing, but no longer moving in one direction. Scenario 2. Dual bloc competition. In this scenario, the red and blue states evolve into economic and political blocs, not separate nations, but distinct spheres of influence. Red states coordinate on energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and regulatory rollback. Blue states coordinate on technology, finance, international alignment, and environmental policy. The blocs compete for investment, talent, and cultural dominance. It resembles the geographic split of ancient empires, Eastern versus Western, not through war, but through competing visions of the future. Scenario 3. Hard break, low probability, high impact. This scenario is not a prediction, but a modeling exercise. Analysts describe a rare but possible chain reaction where several stressors collide at once. Constitutional disputes, contested federal authority, economic compression, and regional resistance. In such a scenario, loyalty shifts quietly from nation to region. Interstate cooperation weakens. Trust in federal structures erodes. Eventually, the question of sovereignty emerges not through declarations, but through gradual alignment. The political version of a slow tectonic slide. Historically, hard breaks occur not when people demand independence, but when they stop recognizing central authority as legitimate. Again, not certainty, scenario. Here's the trap. Fragmentation never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with new borders or new flags. It begins with systems ceasing to work nationally, supply chains regionalizing, political alliances solidifying, identity clustering, and economic networks decoupling. By the time people realize what has shifted, the nation has already become something different. Not collapse, transformation, not rebellion, reconfiguration. Some economists argue that if this pattern applies, the early signals we see today, internal migration, widening economic gaps, declining institutional trust, could be interpreted as precursors to long-term change. But they also argue that multiple outcomes remain possible. A soft landing could stabilize the system. A managed reset of federal-state relations could strengthen national cohesion. And a hard break, while historically dramatic, is only one of many theoretical trajectories. Here's why this matters for every viewer. Understanding these patterns isn't about predicting doom. It's about recognizing how empires, republics, and federations evolve under pressure. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire began drifting as regions developed separate identities and loyalties. In the 19th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire fractured along cultural lines. In the 20th century, the Soviet Union dissolved because its internal republics no longer accepted a shared political center. History shows clearly that fragmentation is a story of incentives, not ideology. Nations endure as long as the incentives align. They drift when incentives change. Let me show you exactly how incentives shape the future. If states benefit more from regional alliances than national unity, they will move toward regional blocs. If federal structures adapt and offer greater flexibility, unity strengthens. If economic divergence widens, political divergence will deepen. If national narratives realign, cohesion becomes possible. Every path depends on incentives: political, economic, cultural, psychological. Here's what nobody tells you. The United States has split before. Not just in 1861, but in dozens of smaller ways. During the Great Depression, during the Civil Rights era, during the energy crises, during constitutional standoffs, and every time the country rebuilt cohesion through negotiation, adaptation, and reinvention. That possibility remains. Nothing about modern divergence guarantees collapse. The patterns suggest scenarios, not destiny. But here's why this moment feels different to many analysts. The forces shaping American identity are no longer national forces. They are regional ones: migration flows, industry clusters, cultural ecosystems, media bubbles, and political coalitions that align along state lines rather than national boundaries. The future will likely be shaped not by a sudden break, but by gradual shifts in how states relate to each other and to Washington. And if this framework is right, even partially, then the question is not, will America break? It is, what version of America emerges from the pressures shaping it now? A more decentralized federation? A nation of cooperating blocs? A re-strengthened union? Or something entirely new? If this opened your eyes to how power, identity, and incentives shape nations far more than borders ever do, then the path forward isn't hidden in speculation. It's hidden in history,